Picture this. On a map from 1743, an empire stretches across half the world, larger than Russia, larger than China, larger than any nation that has ever existed. Its name? Tartary, the Great Tartary. And then, sometime in the 1800s, it simply disappeared. Not conquered, not destroyed. Just erased from every map, every textbook, every official record, as if it never existed at all. What if I told you that empire covered everything from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean? What if I told you its cities had technology we've forgotten? What if I told you that the grandest buildings in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco might actually be the ruins of this lost civilization? Tonight, we're going to explore one of history's most controversial mysteries. Whether you believe it or not, doesn't matter. Whether you're here to fall asleep or to have your mind blown wide open doesn't matter either. You're in exactly the right place. If you're listening from London, it's probably past midnight. If you're in Tokyo, maybe it's your morning commute. Tell me your city and what time it is there. I love reading them. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, let yourself settle in. We're about to take a journey through maps that shouldn't exist, buildings that defy explanation, and photographs that seem to show a world we were never taught about. This is the story of Tartaria. Or rather, it's the story of whether Tartaria is a story at all. Part 1. A civilization erased. What if everything we know about Tartaria is wrong? This question hangs in the air like morning mist over an ancient battlefield. It whispers through online forums, echoes in documentary films, and haunts the minds of researchers who've stumbled across something that doesn't quite fit the official narrative of human history. But let's begin where all good mysteries begin, with what we can actually touch and see and verify. In the reading rooms of the Library of Congress, you can request maps that are 3, 4, sometimes 5 centuries old. The paper crackles when you unfold it. The ink has faded to sepia brown. But there, spelled out in elegant Latin script across what we now call Russia, China, Kazakhstan and Mongolia, you'll see one word repeated again and again: Tartaria. Not just small print in a corner, not a footnote or a trading post. An empire. The largest empire on every single European map from roughly the 13th century to the 19th century. These cartographers, men who risked their reputations on accuracy, drew Tartary as confidently as they drew France or Spain or England. Tartaria, Tartary, Great Tartary, Little Tartary, Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Independent Tartary. The names shift and multiply, but the territory remains consistent, a continental expanse that dwarfs every other political entity on these historical maps. Now here's where it gets interesting. Ask any history professor about the Tartarian Empire and watch their reaction. Most will blink, confused. Some will correct you gently, explaining that Tartary was just an old European term for the lands beyond their knowledge. A convenient label for the vast steppes and forests of Inner Asia, where nomadic peoples roamed and settled in ways European minds couldn't quite categorize. They'll tell you about the real Tatars, Turkic-speaking peoples who absolutely exist today. The Volga Tatars, the Crimean Tatars, dozens of distinct ethnic groups with their own languages, cultures, and histories, stretching back centuries. They'll explain that Tartary wasn't a unified empire at all, but rather a catch-all term that gradually fell out of use as European geographic knowledge improved and political borders were mapped more precisely. This is the mainstream academic position. It's logical, well-researched, and supported by extensive documentation. The Library of Congress agrees. Encyclopaedia Britannica agrees. The vast majority of professional Bruption historians agree. And yet, why does this explanation feel somehow incomplete? Why do some researchers insist that something crucial has been lost, hidden, or deliberately obscured? Why are there people spending their evenings poring over old maps and architectural photographs, convinced they've found evidence of a cover-up that spans centuries? Perhaps it's because the official story, while reasonable, requires us to believe that European cartographers consistently mislabeled half the world for 600 years. It asks us to accept that Tartary was essentially a massive blank space on the map, a placeholder for "here be dragons" that somehow persisted through the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and well into the age of steam engines and telegraphs. Consider this. By the 1700s, Europeans were trading extensively across Asia. They had diplomatic missions in Beijing, commercial outposts in India, and explorers pushing deep into Siberia. Yet their maps continued to show Great Tartary as a distinct political entity, separate from China, separate from Russia, governing a territory larger than modern-day Australia. Were these cartographers simply copying mistakes from earlier maps? Were they deliberately vague about regions they couldn't fully control or understand? Or were they documenting something real, something that later disappeared so completely that we've forgotten it ever existed? The mystery deepens when you realize that the fade-out of Tartary from maps corresponds roughly with the rise of photography and more systematic record-keeping. By the time we had cameras to document the world, Tartary was already gone. By the time we had modern archaeological methods, its traces had allegedly been covered, built over, or absorbed into other national narratives. This timing strikes some researchers as suspicious. They point out that the 19th century wasn't just the era when Tartary disappeared from maps. It was also the century of massive urban reconstruction projects, world's fairs featuring temporary classical architecture, and the establishment of our modern educational systems with their standardized textbooks and official histories. What if, they wonder, the erasure wasn't accidental? What if there were reasons, political, economic, or ideological, to simplify the complex reality of Eurasian civilizations into a neater story about the rise of Western power and Eastern stagnation? Tonight, we're going to hold two ideas in our minds simultaneously. First, the mainstream academic view that Tartary was a geographical term, not a political reality, and that its disappearance from maps simply reflects improving European knowledge of Asian geography and politics. Second, the alternative perspective that something significant has been lost, overlooked, or actively obscured in our understanding of recent history. That the buildings, photographs, and maps that don't quite fit our standard timeline might be telling us something important about who we are and where we came from. We're not here to choose sides. We're here to wonder. We're here to ask questions that might not have easy answers. We're here to let our minds wander through possibilities that textbooks don't explore. Because the truth is, history is stranger than we're usually taught. Civilizations rise and fall in ways that surprise us. Technologies are lost and rediscovered. Entire peoples migrate, adapt, or get absorbed into larger political structures, sometimes leaving only traces in place names, architectural styles, or cultural practices that survive like echoes. Whether you fall asleep tonight believing in a lost Tartarian empire, or convinced it's an interesting but ultimately false theory doesn't matter. What matters is that you've allowed yourself to consider the possibility that the story we've been told might be incomplete. What matters is that somewhere between the crackle of old maps and the whisper of wind through ruins, between the documented facts and the documented silences, there's a mystery worth exploring. So let's explore it together. Let's start with those maps that shouldn't exist. Those vast territories labelled with a name that somehow vanished more completely than Atlantis, more thoroughly than any lost city of legend. What were the cartographers seeing? What were they documenting? And why did it all disappear? Part 2. The maps that shouldn't exist. Picture yourself in the map room of an 18th century library. Candles flicker against leather-bound atlases. The smell of parchment and ink fills the air. You unroll a map dated 1736, created by the cartographer Nicholas Tyndall for his ambitious work Modern Asia. There it is, spread across the page like a sleeping giant. Great Tartary, not tucked away in a corner, not marked with question marks or dotted lines suggesting uncertainty. A fully realized political entity, with borders as confident as those of France or Prussia. The territory encompasses what we now call Siberia, Kazakhstan, Western China, Mongolia, and vast stretches of Central Asia. This isn't a single anomaly. Walk through any collection of pre-19th century European maps, and you'll find them again and again. Nicolas Sanson's La Grande Tartarie from the 1600s shows the same massive territory. Guillaume Delis's maps from the early 1700s consistently mark Tartary Muscovite, Tartary Chinoise, and Tartary Independent as distinct regions within this greater empire. These weren't amateur efforts. Sanson held the title of Royal Geographer to Louis XIV. Delisle was a member of the French Academy of Sciences. These men staked their professional reputations on accuracy. They had access to the most current information from traders, missionaries, and diplomatic missions. Yet they continued to map Tartary as a political reality for centuries. But why did European cartographers adopt this label in the first place? The answer lies in the medieval encounter between European Christianity and the Mongol Empire. When Mongol forces swept across Eurasia in the 13th century, Europeans initially understood them through biblical prophecy. They connected the word Tartar, derived from Tatar, the name of one Mongol tribal confederation, with Tartarus, the classical name for hell. So Tartary began as a catch-all term for the terrifying forces from the east. But something curious happened over the centuries. As European knowledge of Asian geography improved, instead of the term fading away, it became more specific and more detailed. By the 17th century, maps didn't just show Tartary, they showed different kinds of Tartary, each with its own borders, its own relationships to neighbouring powers. Consider the logic of this development. If Tartary were truly just a vague term for unknown lands beyond our borders, why would it become more elaborate and more specific over time? Why would successful cartographers continue to use it when they had access to more precise information about Chinese provinces, Russian territories, and local tribal names? The French cartographer Guillaume Delisle, working in the early 1700s, had access to Jesuit missionary reports from Beijing, Russian exploration records from Siberia, and Ottoman intelligence from Central Asia. Yet his maps still show independent Tartary as a sovereign territory, distinct from Chinese Empire and Russian Empire territories. Here's what makes this especially intriguing. The borders drawn for these Tartary regions aren't arbitrary. They follow consistent geographical and political logic from map to map, decade to decade. Russian Tartary typically includes territories under Russian influence, but not fully integrated into the Russian Empire. Chinese Tartary encompasses regions that pay tribute to Beijing but maintain local autonomy. Independent Tartary represents areas outside both spheres of influence. This suggests the cartographers weren't simply guessing or copying from outdated sources. They were documenting a real political landscape, one complex enough to require multiple categories of sovereignty and control. But then something remarkable happens in the historical record. Starting around 1800, the term Tartary begins to fade from European maps. By 1850, it's largely gone. By 1900, it has vanished completely, replaced by more familiar names: Siberia, Central Asia, Manchuria, Mongolia. The conventional explanation is straightforward. As the Russian Empire expanded eastward, and the Qing dynasty consolidated control over western regions, the complex patchwork of semi-independent territories that Europeans had labelled Tartary was absorbed into clearly defined nation-states. Better surveying techniques and more detailed ethnographic knowledge allowed cartographers to abandon vague umbrella terms in favour of precise political and geographical labels. This explanation makes perfect sense. It's almost certainly correct in its broad outlines, but it doesn't quite account for the timing or the completeness of Tartary's disappearance from the European imagination. Consider this parallel. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, creating 15 new independent nations, European maps didn't suddenly stop showing the territory of the former USSR. They showed the new borders, the new national names, the new political realities, but they also maintained historical awareness that these territories had recently been unified under a different system. Yet with Tartary, something different happened. The territories didn't just get relabeled, they got forgotten. The very concept that these regions had once constituted a distinct political entity vanished from academic discourse, from popular memory, from historical consciousness. By the 20th century, suggesting that something called Great Tartary had existed as late as the 18th century would mark you as either ignorant of basic history or as someone trafficking in conspiracy theories. The erasure was so complete that the existence of hundreds of historical maps documenting this political entity became, paradoxically, evidence against its existence. This is where the mystery deepens into something genuinely puzzling. We can understand why borders shift, why empires fall, why political entities get absorbed into larger structures. But it's much harder to understand why this particular political entity was not just ended, but forgotten, as if it had never existed at all. Imagine if, 300 years from now, historians looked at current maps showing the European Union and declared that no such entity had ever existed. Imagine if they explained away all evidence of EU institutions, EU policies, and EU identity as merely confusion about European geography or outdated umbrella terms for Western Europe. That's essentially what happened to Tartary. The maps are still there, in library collections and digital archives. You can examine them yourself. The evidence of sustained, consistent European recognition of Tartarian political entities is overwhelming and undeniable. What's disputed is not the maps themselves, but what they meant, whether they documented something real or whether they represent centuries of European misunderstanding about Asian political structures. But here's what's particularly intriguing about these maps. They don't just show Tartary as empty space or nomadic wandering. They show cities, they show trade routes, they show political boundaries that suggest administrative systems, taxation systems, defensive systems, all the infrastructure of organized civilization. And some of those cities, some of those trade routes, some of those political centers marked on these old maps don't correspond to anything we recognize in our modern understanding of the region's history. So we're left with questions that don't have easy answers. Questions about the relationship between names and political realities. Questions about how historical knowledge is constructed, maintained, and sometimes lost. Questions about what other aspects of our past might have been simplified, overlooked, or forgotten in the process of creating neat, teachable narratives about the march of civilization. The maps exist. The question is, what exactly did they document? Part 3. The Architecture Puzzle. Walk through downtown Chicago on a quiet Sunday morning. Look up at the buildings around you, really look. Notice something peculiar. The doors are enormous. Not just tall, but proportioned as if they were built for people 12 feet high. The windows soar upward in ways that dwarf human scale. The stone facades feature details carved at heights where no one can properly appreciate them. Step inside the Chicago Cultural Center, originally the Chicago Public Library, built in 1897. The ceilings vault 40 feet above your head. The mosaic domes seem designed for giants. Every proportion suggests that whoever commissioned this building was thinking on a scale that transcends ordinary human needs. Now here's the puzzle. This pattern isn't unique to Chicago. Walk through Boston, Philadelphia Street, Louis, San Francisco, and you'll find the same oversized doors, the same monumental proportions, the same sense that these buildings were designed for a different kind of inhabitant than the people who use them today. The conventional explanation is architectural. These buildings were constructed during the late 1800s and early 1900s, an era when American cities were asserting their cultural sophistication through monumental neoclassical and Beaux-Arts architecture. The style deliberately employed oversized elements to create feelings of awe, dignity, and civic pride. This explanation is well documented and almost certainly correct. The architectural movement spread from European academies to American cities through trained architects who had studied classical proportions in Paris or Rome. The oversized doors, soaring ceilings, and monumental details weren't accidents. They were conscious design choices meant to evoke the grandeur of ancient temples and imperial palaces. But some researchers look at these same buildings and see something else entirely, evidence that they weren't built by 19th century Americans at all. They argue that these structures are remnants of a more advanced civilization, possibly Tartarian, that was later adapted and claimed by the growing American cities. Consider the United States Capitol building. Its cast-iron dome, completed in 1866, rises 288 feet above the ground. The dome itself weighs 8.9 million pounds. The building underneath features corridors wide enough for horse-drawn carriages, stairs built on a scale that makes climbing them feel almost ceremonial, and decorative details carved at heights where they're barely visible from ground level. The official construction timeline shows the Capitol being built in phases from 1793 to 1866, with extensive documentation of every stage of construction. We have the architectural plans, the the contractors' records, the workers' payrolls, and thousands of contemporary photographs showing the building rising floor by floor. Yet some researchers argue that this documentation might be incomplete or misleading. They point to certain architectural details that seem inconsistent with 18th and 19th century American building techniques. They note that the underlying foundation work and basic structural elements appear to employ construction methods that were supposedly unknown in North America until much later. The mystery deepens when you consider the star forts scattered across North America, and indeed, across the continent where Europeans established colonies. These distinctive military installations feature the same geometric patterns, whether they were built in Street, Augustin, Florida, or Valletta, Malta, or Gal, Sri Lanka. Take Castillo de San Marcos in Street Augustin, completed in 1695. The fort's walls rise 30 feet above the water and extend 19 feet below ground level. The coquina stone walls are up to 19 feet thick on the ocean side. The geometric design, with its angular bastions and overlapping fields of fire, represents sophisticated military engineering that could deflect cannon fire and prevent siege ladders from reaching the walls. The standard historical explanation is well documented. These forts represent the spread of Tres Italien fortification, developed in Italy during the Renaissance and refined by French military engineer Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban. The geometric principles spread globally because they worked. The same mathematical relationships that made forts effective in Europe made them effective everywhere else. But alternative researchers note something intriguing. The quality and sophistication of these fortifications often exceeds what you might expect from recently established colonial outposts. The precision of the stonework, the complexity of the internal systems, and the monumental scale suggest engineering capabilities that seem advanced even by European standards of the time. Moreover, many of these installations appear to be built on sites that show evidence of much earlier occupation. Archaeological investigations sometimes reveal foundation layers that don't match the official construction dates, or building techniques that seem to blend European methods with unknown approaches. The puzzle becomes more complex when you examine what researchers call sunken buildings, structures where the current ground level appears to be several feet higher than the original foundation level. In city after city, you can find buildings where what are clearly intended to be first-floor windows are now at or below street level, accessible only by steps leading down. Seattle provides a well-documented example of how this can happen through ordinary historical processes. After the city's Great Fire of 1889, civic leaders decided to raise the street level by as much as 35 feet in some areas to improve drainage and prevent tidal flooding. Buildings that had been constructed at the original ground level were left with their first floors below the new street grade, creating the famous Seattle Underground. Chicago underwent similar grade changes in the 1850s and 1860s, raising streets and even entire buildings to improve sanitation and prevent flooding from Lake Michigan. The engineering feat was so remarkable that it attracted international attention, with thousands of visitors coming to watch buildings being lifted on hydraulic jacks while remaining occupied. These documented cases of street raising and regrading explain many instances of sunken buildings through entirely conventional historical processes. City planners regularly altered urban landscapes for practical reasons, creating the architectural anomalies that some researchers interpret as evidence of buried civilizations. Yet the alternative interpretation persists, that these street-level changes were not improvements to existing cities, but rather attempts to conceal or adapt much older structures that had been built by a previous civilization. The precision of the underlying stonework, the sophistication of the engineering, and the monumental scale of the construction suggest capabilities that exceed what was supposed to be available to 19th century American builders. The question becomes, how do you distinguish between impressive 19th century construction and the remnants of an earlier, more advanced civilization? Both possibilities involve sophisticated engineering, monumental proportions, and building techniques that push the boundaries of what was supposed to be possible in their era. Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between these interpretations, but in recognizing that the line between normal historical architecture and anomalous historical architecture might be blurrier than we typically assume. Perhaps American cities in the 1800s were more sophisticated, more internationally connected, and more technically advanced than our standard narratives suggest. Or perhaps the buildings themselves are trying to tell us something about the people who designed them, something about their aspirations, their capabilities, and their understanding of the relationship between human beings and the structures that house their civilizations. Either way, the next time you walk through an old American city, look up. Notice the proportions. Ask yourself whether the scale feels quite right for the people who were supposed to have built it. The buildings are still there, waiting for us to decode their message. Part 4. The Mud Flood Theory. Imagine waking up one morning to find that your front door is buried 3 feet underground. Your first floor windows are at ankle level. The sidewalk in front of your house has somehow risen above your porch. This is the image that launches one of the most intriguing theories in alternative history, the global mud flood. According to this theory, sometime in the relatively recent past, perhaps the 1800s, a catastrophic event buried cities across the world under layers of mud, soil, and debris. The evidence, proponents argue, is everywhere once you know how to look for it. Buildings with doors below ground level, windows that open onto sidewalks, elaborate stonework visible only in basements that appear to have been designed as first floors. The theory suggests this wasn't a local phenomenon but a global catastrophe that affected cities from New York to Moscow to Shanghai. In the aftermath, survivors allegedly adapted the partially buried structures, building new ground levels on top of the mud, effectively burying entire stories of buildings that had been designed for a different world. Let's examine this possibility seriously, because it addresses real architectural anomalies that you can observe in cities across the world. Walk through Boston's Beacon Hill neighborhood, and you'll find elegant brownstone houses where the front doors are reached by climbing several steps from the sidewalk level. Look more closely, and you'll notice that many buildings have basement windows that seem disproportionately large and ornate for what should be utilitarian underground spaces. Some of these basement levels feature elaborate stonework, decorative moldings, and ceiling heights that suggest they were originally designed as main floors. The same pattern appears in Manhattan. Descend into the basement level of many pre-1900 buildings, and you'll find spaces with architectural details, carved stone, decorative tiles, elaborate ironwork that seem far too sophisticated for areas that were supposedly always underground. The ceiling heights in these spaces often match or exceed those of the floors above. Travel to Europe, and the pattern continues. In Edinburgh, Scotland, entire sections of the old city exist below current street level. In Rome, archaeological excavations routinely reveal that modern ground level sits several feet above ancient street surfaces. In Istanbul, buildings that appear to be single-story structures from street level reveal themselves to be multi-story constructions when viewed from lower elevations. The conventional explanations for these phenomena are well documented and make perfect sense within the context of urban development. Cities regularly undergo grade changes for practical reasons. Flood control, improved drainage, sanitation systems, and transportation infrastructure all require modifications to street levels. Chicago provides the most dramatic documented example. In the 1850s and 1860s, the city undertook a massive engineering project to raise streets by as much as 14 feet in some areas. The project was necessary because the city had been built on marshy ground that was only slightly above the level of Lake Michigan, leading to severe drainage and sanitation problems. The engineering techniques used in Chicago were remarkable. Buildings were lifted on hydraulic jacks and screw jacks while remaining occupied. New foundations were constructed underneath them. Streets were raised and rebuilt. The project was so successful and so well documented that it became a model for urban engineering projects around the world. Seattle underwent a similar transformation after the Great Fire of 1889. Rather than rebuild at the original grade level, city planners decided to raise the streets by as much as 35 feet. This left many buildings with their original first floors below the new street level, creating the network of underground passages that tourists can still visit today. San Francisco, after the 1906 earthquake and fire, used debris from the destruction to fill in parts of the bay and raise ground levels in areas that had been prone to liquefaction during earthquakes. Photographs from the reconstruction period show crews systematically raising street levels using rubble from destroyed buildings. These documented cases of intentional grade raising explain many of the architectural anomalies that fuel mud flood theories. When cities raise their street levels by 10 or 15 feet, buildings that were designed with ground floor entrances suddenly appear to be sunken. Basement windows become street-level windows. Underground spaces that were designed for storage or utilities end up with proportions that seem suitable for human habitation. But the mud flood theory proposes something different, that these grade changes weren't planned urban improvements, but responses to a catastrophic event that buried cities under layers of sediment. The theory suggests that the buried levels contain evidence of more sophisticated architecture, more advanced building techniques, and more elaborate decorative elements than should have been available to the supposed builders. Geological evidence provides another lens through which to examine these claims. True debris flows, what geologists call mud flows, do occur naturally and can deposit significant amounts of sediment in short periods. Volcanic lahars, glacial outburst floods, and extreme rainfall events can move enormous quantities of mud, rocks, and organic matter across vast distances. Mount St. Helens, when it erupted in 1980, generated lahars that deposited up to 600 feet of debris in some river valleys. The Spokane floods, caused by the collapse of glacial Lake Missoula, moved sediment across thousands of square miles of the Pacific Northwest. These natural processes can indeed bury human structures under substantial depths of material. However, geological evidence for a recent global mud flood event is remarkably absent from the scientific record. Sediment layers in lakes, river deltas, and ocean floors provide continuous records of deposition over thousands of years. Ice cores preserve annual records of atmospheric conditions. Tree rings document climate variations with year-by-year precision. If a global catastrophe had deposited significant amounts of sediment across multiple continents within the last few centuries, it would leave unmistakable traces in these natural archives. The absence of such evidence in the geological record poses significant challenges for global mudflood theories. Moreover, the buried architectural elements that fuel these theories often turn out to have conventional explanations when examined in detail. The elaborate stonework found in the basement levels frequently reflects the fact that 19th century builders used high-quality materials throughout their structures, not just in visible areas. The oversized proportions of underground spaces often result from the practical requirements of structural engineering. Load-bearing walls, foundation systems, and utility access all require more space than modern construction techniques. Yet the mud flood theory persists because it addresses something real in human experience, the sense that our cities contain layers of history that don't quite match the official narratives we've been taught. The feeling that the buildings around us encode stories about technical capabilities, aesthetic sensibilities, and social organizations that are more complex than our simplified historical accounts suggest. Whether or not you accept the mud flood theory as literal truth, it serves as a reminder that urban landscapes are palimpsests, surfaces that have been written on, erased, and written on again multiple times. Every city contains evidence of previous versions of itself, previous ways of organizing space, previous relationships between human beings and their built environment. The mud may not have been deposited by a global catastrophe, but it was certainly deposited by time, by countless decisions about how to adapt old structures to new needs, by the accumulated weight of history itself. And sometimes, when you're walking down an old city street and notice architectural details that don't quite make sense, you're seeing traces of those buried stories trying to surface again. Part 5. The World's Fair's Mystery. Picture Chicago in 1893. The world has come to witness the world's Columbian Exposition, commemorating the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. But what visitors see takes their breath away. A gleaming white city of unprecedented grandeur rising from the shores of Lake Michigan. Massive domed. Buildings stretch as far as the eye can see. Classical columns support elaborate facades. Waterways wind between structures that appear to rival the greatest achievements of Rome or Athens. The scale is breathtaking. The Manufactures and Liberal Arts building alone covers more than 30 acres, making it the largest structure ever built at that time. Here's what seems impossible. This entire complex was supposedly constructed in just over 2 years, from 1891 to 1893. Hundreds of buildings, miles of waterways, elaborate landscaping, working transportation systems, and infrastructure to support 27 million visitors, all built from nothing in less time than it takes most cities to plan a single major construction project. The official story is well documented. The fair was designed by a team led by architect Daniel Burnham and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted. The buildings were constructed primarily using a material called staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris, cement, and fibrous materials that could be moulded, shaped, and painted to look like stone but was much cheaper and faster to work with than actual masonry. Staff was perfect for temporary construction. It could be applied over wooden and steel frames in thin layers, moulded into elaborate decorative details, and painted to achieve any desired finish. The material allowed builders to create the appearance of classical stone architecture at a fraction of the cost and time that would have been required for real stone construction. The construction timeline shows systematic development. Site preparation began in 1891, major structural work progressed through 1892, and finishing details were completed in early 1893. Thousands of workers were employed on the site. Detailed payroll records, supply invoices, and construction photographs document every stage of the building process. After the fair closed in October 1893, most of the buildings were demolished or destroyed by fire. Only the Palace of Fine Arts, constructed of more permanent materials, survived to become what is now the Museum of Science and Industry. The rest of the White City disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only photographs, postcards, and memories. This is the conventional narrative, and it's supported by extensive documentation held in archives at the University of Chicago, the Chicago Public Library, and the Newberry Library. You can examine construction contracts, architectural plans, material specifications, and thousands of photographs that show the buildings rising from empty ground. Yet some researchers look at these same photographs and see something that doesn't quite add up. The speed of construction seems implausible, even accounting for the use of staff and temporary materials. The sophistication of the infrastructure, electrical systems, plumbing, transportation networks, appears to exceed what should have been possible with 1890s technology working on such an accelerated timeline. More intriguingly, they argue that the architectural details visible in photographs show elements that are inconsistent with staff construction. Some decorative elements appear to have the depth, texture, and weathering patterns of genuine stone rather than moulded plaster. Some structural elements seem more substantial and permanent than would be necessary for a temporary exhibition lasting only 6 months. The alternative theory suggests that the World's Columbian Exposition, and indeed World's Fairs in general, weren't built from scratch but rather involved the restoration and temporary adaptation of much older structures. According to this interpretation, the White City was actually a collection of existing buildings that had been abandoned, partially ruined, or buried, then cleaned up and repurposed for the exposition. This theory extends beyond Chicago to other major World's Fairs of the late 1800s and early 1900s. The Paris Exposition of 1889, which introduced the Eiffel Tower, also featured elaborate temporary buildings that were supposedly demolished after the fair. The Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in 1901 created an entire rainbow city of coloured buildings that existed for only 6 months before being destroyed. The pattern is consistent. Elaborate architectural complexes created in impossibly short timeframes, used briefly for international exhibitions, then systematically demolished rather than preserved for future use. To alternative researchers, this pattern suggests that these weren't temporary constructions at all, but rather opportunities to briefly reveal much older structures before covering them up again. Consider the practical implications of this alternative theory. If World's Fair organisers were actually working with existing architecture, it would explain the speed of construction, the sophistication of the infrastructure, and the apparent quality of materials that exceed what should have been possible with temporary building techniques. It would also provide a motive for the systematic demolition after each fair. If the goal was to briefly display older architecture while maintaining the official narrative that it had been built specifically for the exposition, then destroying the evidence after the fair closed would be essential to preserving the cover story. The Chicago fire that destroyed most of the White City in 1894 has struck some researchers as suspiciously convenient. Fires also destroyed significant portions of other World's Fair sites, often within a few years of the exhibition's closing. These fires eliminated physical evidence that might have contradicted the official construction narratives. However, documentary evidence provides strong support for the conventional explanation. Construction. Photographs from the Chicago Fair show the buildings rising from foundation level. You can see wooden framing being erected, staff being applied over the frames, and decorative details being molded and attached. The photographic record appears to document genuine construction rather than restoration or cleanup of existing structures. Moreover, the material properties of staff explain many of the apparent anomalies. When properly mixed and applied, staff could achieve remarkable durability and detail. The material could be tinted, textured, and finished to closely mimic stone, marble, or other expensive materials. Professional craftsmen working with staff could create decorative elements that were virtually indistinguishable from carved stone in photographs. The electrical and plumbing systems that seemed so sophisticated were actually cutting-edge demonstrations of new technologies. The Chicago Fair was specifically designed to showcase American technological achievement, particularly in electric lighting and power distribution. The infrastructure wasn't beyond the capabilities of 1890s engineering. It was the best that 1890s engineering could achieve when cost was no object and international prestige was at stake. Yet the alternative interpretation persists because it addresses something genuinely puzzling about the World's Fair phenomenon: the apparent disconnect between the monumental scale of these temporary constructions and their brief lifespans. Why invest such enormous resources in creating architectural marvels that were designed to be destroyed? The answer may lie in understanding World's Fairs as exercises in collective imagination, attempts to create temporary glimpses of possible futures rather than permanent additions to the urban landscape. The White City wasn't meant to last because it was meant to inspire. It was designed to show visitors what American cities could become if they embraced classical planning principles, electric lighting, and coordinated architectural design. In this sense, the World's Fairs succeeded beyond their organizers' wildest dreams. The neoclassical revival that swept American architecture in the early 1900s drew direct inspiration from the Chicago Fair. The City Beautiful movement, which transformed urban planning across the United States, traced its origins to visitors' experiences walking through Burnham's carefully designed temporary city. But the mystery remains: if these were truly temporary constructions built specifically for short-term exhibitions, why do they continue to haunt our imagination more than a century later? Why do photographs of the White City still strike viewers as depicting something that seems almost too magnificent to have been real? Perhaps because, in creating their temporary glimpses of architectural possibility, the World's Fair builders tapped into something deeper than mere exhibition design. Perhaps they created spaces that resonated with collective memories of what human civilization had been capable of in the past, or collective dreams of what it might become capable of in the future. Whether those memories and dreams reflected historical reality or imaginative projection, the World's Fairs left an indelible mark on everyone who experienced them. And in trying to understand what exactly that mark represents, we find ourselves asking the same questions that echo through every aspect of the Tartaria mystery. What are we remembering? What are we forgetting? And what are we afraid to remember? Part 6. The Erasure of a People. If there truly was a vast Tartarian civilization stretching across half the world, controlling territory larger than any empire in recorded history, building cities of unprecedented grandeur, and developing technologies we've somehow forgotten, then we must ask the most haunting question of all: where did the people go? This question cuts to the heart of why the Tartaria theory troubles so many people. Empires fall, cities crumble, technologies are lost. These things happen throughout history. But the complete disappearance of an entire civilization, leaving behind only architectural remnants and fading map labels, requires something more dramatic than ordinary historical processes. Let's begin with what we know for certain. The word Tartar originally referred to a specific tribal confederation within the Mongol Empire of the 13th century. European chroniclers, encountering Mongol forces for the first time, corrupted Tartar into Tartar and associated it with Tartarus, the classical name for hell, reflecting their terror at these unknown warriors from the east. Over time, Tartar became a European catch-all term for the diverse peoples of the Eurasian steppes. It was applied to Mongols, Turks, Tungusic groups, and dozens of other distinct ethnicities who shared certain cultural patterns: pastoral nomadism, horse-based warfare, and political structures that seemed foreign to European feudal systems. But here's what's crucial: the Tatars never disappeared. Today, more than 7 million people worldwide identify as Tatar or belong to Tatar ethnic groups. The Volga Tatars of Russia number over 5 million. The Crimean Tatars, despite centuries of persecution and forced deportations, maintain their distinct language and culture. There are Siberian Tatars, Lithuanian Tatars, Polish Tatars, and dozens of smaller Tatar communities scattered across Eurasia. These aren't archaeological curiosities or extinct peoples known only from historical records. They're living communities with contemporary literature, music, cuisine, and cultural traditions. Many Tatar languages are actively spoken, taught in schools, and used in media and government in regions where Tatars form significant populations. So from one perspective, the Tatars never vanished at all. What disappeared was not a people, but a European way of categorizing and understanding the complex ethnic landscape of Inner Asia. As European knowledge of the region improved, as political boundaries became more precise, and as ethnographic research became more sophisticated, the umbrella term Tartary gave way to more specific ethnic and political designations. This explanation aligns with broader patterns in the history of ethnographic terminology. Europeans initially used broad, often inaccurate categories to describe peoples and places beyond their direct experience, then gradually developed more precise and respectful terminology as their knowledge improved. But alternative researchers argue that this conventional explanation obscures something more significant: a deliberate process of cultural erasure that eliminated not just a political entity, but the memory of that entity's achievements. According to this view, what we call Tatars today are the remnants of a much larger, more advanced civilization that was systematically dismantled and absorbed into other political structures. The architectural monuments, the technological capabilities, and the territorial extent suggested by historical maps all point to a level of civilizational achievement that exceeds what we typically associate with nomadic steppe peoples. Consider the implications of this alternative interpretation. If Tartary was indeed a unified political entity capable of the architectural and engineering feats attributed to it, then its dissolution would necessarily have involved the dispersal, assimilation, or elimination of whatever population had created and maintained that civilization. This is where the theory becomes both more specific and more troubling. Some researchers suggest that the Tartarian people didn't simply fade away through normal historical processes, but were systematically targeted for cultural destruction. They point to patterns of forced resettlement, cultural suppression, and historical revisionism that allegedly eliminated Tartarian identity. While preserving only scattered remnants under different ethnic labels, the Crimean Tatars provide a documented example of how such processes can work. Under Soviet rule, particularly under Stalin, Crimean Tatars were subjected to massive deportations. In 1944, the entire Crimean Tatar population, nearly 200,000 people, was forcibly relocated to Central Asia. Thousands died during the deportation, and those who survived were forbidden to return to Crimea or maintain their cultural institutions. For decades, Soviet authorities denied that Crimean Tatars had ever formed a distinct people or had any historical connection to Crimea. Official histories were rewritten to eliminate references to Tatar contributions to regional culture, architecture, and political development. The goal was not just political control but cultural erasure, the elimination of Crimean Tatar identity from historical memory. This documented case demonstrates that the systematic erasure of ethnic and cultural identities is not merely theoretical, but has occurred within living memory. It shows how state power can be used not just to control populations, but to rewrite the historical record to eliminate inconvenient cultural identities. If similar processes occurred on a larger scale during earlier historical periods, they could theoretically explain the disappearance of a Tartarian cultural identity while leaving behind the architectural and cartographic evidence that fuels contemporary speculation. However, this explanation faces significant challenges. Cultural erasure on the scale required by Tartarian theories would have required coordination across multiple empires, languages, and political systems over several centuries. It would have had to eliminate not just political structures but also oral traditions, material culture, and collective memory across a territory larger than any single political entity has ever controlled. Moreover, the historical record shows that steppe peoples were remarkably resilient in maintaining their cultural identities even under extreme pressure. The Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, was created and maintained by steppe peoples using traditional pastoral and military techniques. Their political structures were sophisticated enough to govern sedentary agricultural populations across Eurasia while maintaining distinctly nomadic cultural patterns. The survival of Tatar communities through centuries of imperial expansion, religious conversion, and political upheaval suggests that complete cultural erasure would have been extremely difficult to achieve without leaving more obvious traces in the historical record. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between complete disappearance and simple terminology change. Perhaps what happened to the Tartars reflects broader patterns of cultural transformation that occurred as nomadic societies encountered expanding agricultural empires and industrial technologies. Many traditional steppe societies underwent profound changes during the 18th and 19th centuries as Russian, Chinese, and Ottoman empires extended direct control over previously autonomous regions. Some communities were absorbed into imperial structures, adopting sedentary lifestyles and gradually losing traditional cultural practices. Others maintained their ethnic identities, but were integrated into new political frameworks that obscured their historical autonomy. The result was a complex process of cultural continuity and change that doesn't fit neatly into either complete erasure or simple survival categories. Tatar peoples maintained their languages, religions, and many traditional practices, but the political structures that had once unified them across vast territories were replaced by imperial administrative systems. This transformation explains why modern Tatar communities are culturally Tatar but politically Russian, Chinese, or citizens of other contemporary nation-states. It explains why traditional steppe political structures are remembered in oral traditions and cultural practices, but don't appear in modern political maps. And it explains why someone looking at historical maps showing Great Tartary and comparing them to modern ethnic distributions might conclude that a great civilization had been erased, while someone examining the continuity of Tatar cultural practices might conclude that nothing had been lost at all. Both perspectives capture something real about the complex relationship between political structures, cultural identities, and historical memory. The people didn't disappear, but the political world they had inhabited was transformed beyond recognition. Part 7. The Timeline Problem. What if our entire understanding of when things happened is wrong? What if the timeline we've been taught, with its neat progression from medieval to Renaissance to modern, contains gaps, insertions, or deliberate distortions that hide the true sequence of human history? This is the foundation of one of the most radical theories connected to Tartaria research, the idea that our chronology itself has been manipulated. Some researchers argue that centuries of history have been artificially inserted into the timeline, while others suggest that recent centuries have been systematically misdated to conceal evidence of more advanced civilizations that existed far more recently than official history admits. The timeline problems begin with simple observations that don't quite fit standard historical narratives. Why do buildings from the supposedly primitive medieval period sometimes display more sophisticated engineering than structures built centuries later? Why do certain technologies appear, disappear, and then reappear in ways that suggest knowledge was lost and rediscovered rather than progressively developed? Consider Gothic cathedrals. These magnificent structures, supposedly built during the Dark Ages by people with limited mathematical knowledge and primitive tools, demonstrate engineering capabilities that challenge modern architects. The flying buttresses of Notre Dame de Paris, completed in the 13th century, solved structural problems using principles that weren't formally codified until the development of modern engineering in the 19th century. How did medieval builders achieve such sophisticated results without the mathematical framework that supposedly underlies their techniques? How did they coordinate construction projects that lasted centuries, maintaining consistent architectural vision across generations of craftsmen? And why did their methods apparently become lost only to be rediscovered during the Renaissance? The conventional explanation involves the gradual development and transmission of craft knowledge through guilds and monastic institutions. Medieval builders learned through apprenticeship and direct experience, developing practical solutions that worked even if they couldn't explain why in formal mathematical terms. Their methods weren't lost, but rather evolved into different approaches as architectural styles and social structures changed. But some researchers see a different pattern, evidence that medieval builders had access to more advanced knowledge than our timeline suggests should have been available. They point to construction techniques, mathematical relationships, and engineering solutions that appear to reflect sophisticated understanding of physics and mathematics. This leads to speculation about phantom time, the hypothesis that substantial portions of our timeline are fictional insertions that were added to historical records during the medieval period or later. According to the most radical versions of this theory, several centuries of European history, particularly the early medieval period, were fabricated by later scholars and political authorities to create a more impressive genealogy for European civilization. The phantom time hypothesis was most famously proposed by German historian Heribert Illig, who argued that the years from 614 to 911 CE never actually occurred. According to Illig, this period was inserted into the timeline by Holy Roman Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II around 1000 CE to place themselves at the beginning of a new millennium and to create a more impressive imperial lineage. If Illig's hypothesis were correct, events that supposedly occurred during the missing centuries, including the rise of Islam, the Carolingian Empire, and much of early medieval European development, would need to be reassigned to different time periods or eliminated from history entirely. However, the phantom time hypothesis faces overwhelming scientific and historical challenges. Multiple independent dating methods confirm the conventional timeline with remarkable precision. Dendrochronology, the analysis of tree ring patterns, provides year-by-year dating that extends back thousands of years. These tree ring chronologies have been cross-checked against radiocarbon dating, ice core analysis, and astronomical records, all of which converge on the same timeline. The IntCal 20 calibration curve, published in 2020, represents the most comprehensive effort to date to create a precise chronological framework for the last 55,000 years. This calibration curve integrates tree ring data, coral growth records, lake sediment cores, and other natural archives to create a timeline accurate to within individual years for much of the period that phantom time theories claim was fabricated. Moreover, astronomical records provide independent verification of historical dates. Ancient chroniclers frequently recorded eclipses, comets, and other celestial events with enough detail that modern astronomers can calculate exactly when they occurred. These astronomical anchors are distributed throughout the supposedly phantom centuries, making it impossible to remove substantial portions of the timeline without breaking these natural chronological markers. Islamic, Chinese, and other non-European historical records also provide continuous chronologies that overlap with European sources during the supposedly phantom periods. For the phantom time hypothesis to be correct, the fabrication would have required coordination across multiple civilizations, languages, and cultural traditions, a conspiracy of impossible complexity and scope. Yet timeline questions persist in Tartaria research, because they address real puzzles about technological development and cultural transmission. Why do certain capabilities appear to have been more advanced in the past than they were centuries later? Why do some architectural achievements seem to exceed what should have been possible with the tools and knowledge available at their supposed construction dates? These puzzles don't necessarily require phantom centuries to explain. Alternative explanations include the uneven pace of technological development, the loss of specific techniques during periods of social upheaval, and the tendency of historical records to underrepresent the sophistication of practical knowledge held by craftsmen and engineers. Consider the Roman Empire's concrete technology, which produced structures like the Pantheon that have lasted 2,000 years, while many medieval and early modern buildings crumbled within centuries. This technology was largely lost during the medieval period and wasn't fully understood again until the 20th century. The loss and rediscovery of Roman concrete doesn't require timeline manipulation. It reflects the complex relationship between practical knowledge and social continuity. Similar patterns appear throughout history. The Damascus steel techniques of medieval Islamic smiths produced blades of legendary quality that modern metallurgists struggled to replicate. The precise methods used by Stradivarius to create his violins remain partially mysterious despite centuries of analysis. Many traditional building techniques used by indigenous peoples worldwide demonstrate environmental adaptation and structural ingenuity that formal engineering education didn't recognize until recently. These examples suggest that the relationship between primitive and advanced techniques is more complex than linear progress models suggest. Practical knowledge, developed through generations of experimentation and refinement, sometimes produces results that exceed what formal scientific theory predicts should be possible. This complexity provides a different lens through which to examine timeline questions in Tartaria research. Rather than requiring phantom centuries or timeline manipulation, the apparent anomalies might reflect the sophistication of traditional knowledge systems that our historical narratives have systematically underestimated. If Tartarian civilization achieved remarkable architectural and engineering results, it may have done so through accumulated practical knowledge rather than formally codified scientific principles. If this knowledge was transmitted through guild systems, oral traditions, or other non-written channels, its loss during periods of social disruption could explain why later builders seem to lack capabilities that earlier craftsmen had possessed. The timeline problems in Tartaria research ultimately reflect broader questions about how we understand historical development. Do civilizations necessarily progress from simple to complex? Can knowledge be lost as well as gained? And how do we account for achievements that seem to exceed what our models predict should have been possible? These questions don't have simple answers, but they remind us that history is more complex, more non-linear, and more surprising than the neat chronological frameworks we use to organize our understanding of the past. Part 8. The Free Energy Theory. Imagine walking through a city where street lamps never need fuel, where factories run without coal or steam, where the very architecture generates and distributes power through principles that modern science has forgotten. According to one of the most fascinating theories surrounding Tartaria, this isn't fantasy, it's a description of how the world actually worked until relatively recently. The free energy theory suggests that Tartarian civilization had mastered wireless power transmission on a global scale. The evidence, proponents argue, is hidden in plain sight: the domes, spires, and ornate metalwork that crown buildings across the world weren't merely decorative, but functional components of a planetary energy grid that could power entire cities without centralized generation, plants, or transmission lines. This theory draws heavily on the work of Nikola Tesla, whose experiments with wireless power transmission in the early 1900s demonstrated that electrical energy could indeed be transmitted through the air without wires. Tesla's famous Colorado Springs laboratory, operational from 1899 to 1900, generated artificial lightning bolts up to 135 feet long and successfully transmitted power wirelessly to light bulbs located miles away. Tesla's most ambitious project was Wardenclyffe Tower, constructed on Long Island between 1901 and 1905. This massive transmitter, standing 187 feet tall with foundations extending 120 feet underground, was designed to demonstrate global wireless communication and potentially wireless power transmission. The tower's design incorporated principles that Tesla believed would allow it to tap into what he called the Earth's natural electrical charge, and distribute power wirelessly to receiving stations around the world. Tesla envisioned a future where every home and business could access unlimited clean energy simply by connecting to this global wireless network. However, Wardenclyffe Tower never achieved its intended purpose. Tesla's financial backer, J.P. Morgan, withdrew support when he realized that wireless power transmission would make it impossible to meter and charge for electrical consumption. Without a way to control access to the power supply, there would be no way to generate profits from electrical distribution. The tower was demolished in 1917, its materials sold to pay Tesla's debts. No other large-scale wireless power transmission projects were attempted, and Tesla's dream of free global energy was abandoned in favor of the centralized power generation and wired distribution systems that still dominate our electrical infrastructure today. According to free energy theorists, this abandonment wasn't simply a matter of technical and economic limitations. They argue that Tesla's work represented the rediscovery of power transmission principles that an earlier civilization, possibly Tartarian, had already perfected and implemented globally. The evidence they cite is architectural. Look closely at 19th century buildings and you'll notice that many feature elaborate metal spires, ornate copper domes, and decorative ironwork that seem disproportionately expensive and complex for mere ornamentation. These metallic elements are often positioned at the highest points of structures and connected to the building's framework in ways that suggest they might have served as more than decoration. Consider the dome of the United States Capitol, completed in 1866. This cast-iron structure, weighing nearly 9 million pounds, is topped by a bronze Statue of Freedom that rises 307 feet above ground level. The dome includes an intricate iron framework, copper cladding, and grounding systems that theorists argue could have functioned as a massive antenna or resonance device. Similar domed structures crown important buildings across America and Europe. State capitals, courthouses, churches, and civic buildings feature prominent metallic domes, often surrounded by elaborate ironwork and topped with metal finials, weather vanes, or decorative elements that could potentially serve as electrical collectors or transmitters. The free energy theory suggests that these architectural elements weren't added for aesthetic reasons, but were functional components of a global power distribution system. The domes and spires allegedly served as resonant collectors that could capture atmospheric electrical energy or receive power transmitted from larger generation facilities. The metal framework within buildings would then distribute this power throughout the structure. Star forts, those distinctive geometric military installations found on every continent, are also interpreted through this lens. Rather than defensive structures, free energy theorists argue that star forts were actually power generation or distribution facilities. The precise geometric patterns, the extensive underground chambers, and the thick walls filled with metal components all suggest purposes beyond military defense. The theory proposes that this global energy system was deliberately dismantled during the 19th century to create dependence on controlled, profitable energy sources. The rise of coal-powered industry, oil-based transportation, and centralized electrical grids allegedly replaced a decentralized system that had provided abundant clean energy to previous civilizations. However, this interpretation faces significant scientific and historical challenges. While Tesla did successfully demonstrate wireless power transmission over short distances, the physics of long-range wireless power transmission present obstacles that he was unable to overcome. Wireless power transmission works through electromagnetic induction, but the efficiency of power transfer decreases dramatically with distance. Tesla's experiments at Colorado Springs achieved impressive visual effects, but delivered relatively small amounts of actual power to receiving devices. The energy required to transmit significant amounts of power over continental distances would be enormous, and much of it would be lost to the atmosphere rather than captured by receiving equipment. Moreover, wireless power transmission creates electromagnetic fields that would interfere with radio communications, electronic devices, and potentially biological systems. A global wireless power network would generate electromagnetic signatures detectable by modern scientific instruments, but no evidence of such a network appears in atmospheric or geological measurements. The architectural element cited as evidence of free energy systems have well-documented conventional purposes. Building domes serve structural, aesthetic, and sometimes acoustic functions. The metal frameworks support the weight of the dome and protect against lightning strikes. The elaborate ironwork reflects the technological capabilities and artistic sensibilities of 19th century metalworking, not necessarily electrical functions. Grounding systems in historical buildings were designed to protect against lightning damage, a serious concern for tall structures in an era before lightning rods became common. The copper and iron elements found in building frameworks serve structural and protective purposes that don't require wireless power transmission to explain. Star forts represent the global spread of Tres Italien military engineering, developed in Renaissance Italy and refined by military engineers like Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban. The geometric designs, underground chambers, and thick walls all serve documented military purposes, deflecting cannon fire, providing overlapping fields of defensive fire, and protecting garrisons during sieges. Yet the free energy theory persists because it addresses something genuinely puzzling about historical technological development. Why did Tesla's promising research into wireless power transmission end so abruptly? Why haven't modern scientists pursued similar approaches despite growing concerns about energy sustainability and distribution? The answer may lie in the practical and economic constraints that limited Tesla's work, rather than in conspiracy theories about suppressed technology. Wireless power transmission, while scientifically possible, faces fundamental physics limitations that make it less efficient than wired distribution for most applications. Modern research has revived interest in wireless power for specific applications, charging electric vehicles, powering remote sensors, or eliminating cables in electronic devices, but these applications confirm, rather than challenge, the physical limitations that Tesla encountered. The real mystery isn't whether Tartarian civilization possessed free energy technology that was later suppressed. The mystery is why humans continue to dream of such technology, and why stories of lost advanced capabilities resonate so strongly with our collective imagination. Perhaps because the dream of abundant, clean, freely available energy addresses some of our deepest hopes about what human civilization might become capable of achieving. Part 9. Global Clues Beyond Asia. The Tartaria mystery refuses to stay contained within the borders of historical maps, from the star-shaped fortress walls of Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine, Florida, to the buried streets of Seattle's underground, from the geometric precision of Fort McHenry and Baltimore Harbor to the mysterious cave systems rumored to exist beneath the Grand Canyon. Evidence of something unusual appears on every continent. But what kind of evidence are we actually examining? And how do we distinguish between the remnants of a lost global civilization and the natural result of human ingenuity spreading similar solutions to similar problems? Across the world. Let's begin with the star forts, because they represent perhaps the most compelling global pattern in alternative historical research. These distinctive fortifications, with their angular bastions and geometric precision, appear virtually everywhere. Europeans established military outposts, North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Australia, and numerous islands scattered across the world's oceans. Walk around Castillo de San Marcos, and you'll understand why these structures capture the imagination. Construction began in 1672 and continued for 23 years. The walls rise 30 feet above the water level and extend 19 feet below ground. On the ocean-facing side, the walls are 19 feet thick, massive enough to withstand direct cannon bombardment while providing platforms for dozens of artillery pieces. The fort's star-shaped design creates overlapping fields of fire that eliminate blind spots and force attacking forces into carefully planned kill zones. The angular bastions deflect cannonballs, rather than absorbing their full impact. The thick coquina stone walls, formed from compressed shells and coral, provide structural strength while remaining soft enough that cannonballs embed rather than shattering the masonry. This represents sophisticated military engineering that takes into account ballistics, structural mechanics, and tactical psychology. The builders understood how different angles affect the trajectory of projectiles, how various materials respond to impact, and how fortress design can channel enemy movement into predictable patterns. Now, here's what's remarkable. Virtually identical design principles appear in fortifications built by the Dutch in Indonesia, the Portuguese in Brazil, the British in India, and the Spanish across their colonial empire. Fort de Joux in France, completed in the 17th century, shares the same geometric logic as Fort Jesus in Mombasa, Kenya, built during the same period by Portuguese engineers. The conventional explanation is well documented. This represents the global spread of Tres Italienne fortification, developed in Renaissance Italy and refined by military engineers across Europe. As European powers expanded their colonial empires, they brought their most advanced military architecture with them, adapting basic principles to local conditions and materials. The mathematics underlying these designs became standardized through military engineering education. Students at European military academies learned the same geometric principles, studied the same siege warfare techniques, and applied the same solutions regardless of where their careers eventually took them. This explains the remarkable consistency of star fort design across continents and centuries, but alternative researchers note something intriguing about the quality and precision of these global fortifications. Many exceed what you might expect from colonial outposts built by small expeditionary forces using local materials and labour. The stonework is often more precise, the engineering more sophisticated, and the scale more monumental than the official construction timelines and resource constraints would seem to allow. Consider Fort Zachary Taylor in Key West, Florida, begun in 1845. This massive hexagonal fortress required the construction of artificial islands, the transportation of millions of tons of stone, and engineering solutions to problems of saltwater infiltration and hurricane resistance that challenged the best military engineers of the period. The fort's design incorporates features that seem to anticipate technologies that weren't officially developed until decades later: sophisticated drainage systems, ventilation networks, and structural techniques that modern engineers recognize as remarkably advanced for their supposed construction period. Similar patterns appear in the buried downtowns found in cities across North America. Seattle's underground represents the most famous example, created when the city raised street levels by up to 35 feet after the Great Fire of 1889. But Seattle isn't unique. Similar buried districts exist in Chicago, Galveston, Sacramento, and other cities that underwent major reconstruction during the late 1800s. The conventional explanations are thoroughly documented. Chicago systematically raised its streets during the 1850s and 1860s to improve drainage and prevent sewage backups from Lake Michigan. The engineering project was so remarkable that it attracted international attention. Entire city blocks were lifted on hydraulic jacks while remaining occupied by businesses and residents. Galveston raised its elevation by as much as 17 feet following the devastating hurricane of 1900. Sacramento built levees and raised street levels to prevent flooding from the American River. Each of these projects involved moving millions of tons of earth and debris in response to specific local conditions and disasters. Yet some researchers argue that these documented regrading projects might have served a dual purpose, solving practical urban problems while simultaneously concealing evidence of much older construction. They point to the architectural sophistication of the basement levels revealed by these grade changes, spaces that seem too elaborate and well-proportioned for utilitarian underground use. The theory extends to natural disasters that affected major cities during the late 1800s and early 1900s. San Francisco's 1906 earthquake and fire destroyed approximately 28,000 buildings and left more than 3,000 people dead. The destruction was so complete that entire neighborhoods had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Chicago's Great Fire of 1871 consumed approximately 17,500 structures across more than 2,100 acres. The rebuilding process transformed the city's architecture, infrastructure, and urban planning on a scale that hadn't been seen since the city's founding. Alternative researchers note that these disasters provided opportunities to systematically eliminate older architectural styles and building techniques that might not have fit the official narrative of American urban development. The rebuilding programs that followed could theoretically have incorporated remnants of earlier construction while creating the appearance of entirely new development. However, photographic evidence from these disasters and reconstruction periods provides extensive documentation of the destruction and rebuilding processes. Before and after photographs show the progression from ruins to new construction. Contemporary newspapers, insurance records, and city planning documents detail every aspect of the recovery efforts. The Grand Canyon Egyptian caves represent a different kind of global anomaly that frequently appears in Tartaria research. According to a story published in the Phoenix Gazette in 1909, Smithsonian archaeologist G.E. Kincaid allegedly discovered an enormous underground complex containing Egyptian artifacts, hieroglyphs, and evidence of an ancient civilization in the Grand Canyon. The story describes caverns large enough to hold 50,000 people, filled with copper tools, Egyptian-style mummies, and hieroglyphic inscriptions that suggest contact between ancient Egypt and pre-Columbian North America. According to the report, the Smithsonian Institution immediately classified the discovery and restricted access to the area to prevent public knowledge of findings that would revolutionize understanding of ancient history. This story has become a cornerstone of alternative historical research, cited as evidence that mainstream archaeology systematically suppresses discoveries that contradict official narratives. The restriction of access allegedly continues to the present day, with the area remaining off-limits to independent researchers. However, extensive investigation by historians and archaeologists has revealed that the 1909 Phoenix Gazette story was almost certainly a hoax. No Smithsonian employee named G.E. Kincaid existed during that period. The supposed location of the caves doesn't match any known geological formations in the Grand Canyon. The Smithsonian Institution has no records of such a discovery or any ongoing classification of archaeological sites in the region. The story appears to have been fabricated for entertainment purposes, possibly inspired by contemporary interest in Egyptian archaeology, following well-publicized discoveries in the Valley of the Kings. Similar hoax stories appeared in newspapers across the American West during the early 20th century, reflecting public fascination with lost civilizations and ancient mysteries. Yet the persistence of the Grand Canyon Caves story in alternative research demonstrates something important about how evidence is evaluated and interpreted. When researchers begin with the assumption that mainstream institutions are suppressing significant discoveries, any absence of evidence can be reinterpreted as evidence of suppression rather than evidence of absence. This pattern appears throughout global Tartaria research. Architectural anomalies, historical gaps, and official denials are all interpreted as confirmation that something significant is being concealed, rather than as indication that the theoretical framework might need revision. Part 10. The photos nobody explains. There's something haunting about old photographs of American cities. Streets stretch into the distance, perfectly paved and geometrically precise, but they're completely empty. Grand buildings rise on either side, elaborate facades with intricate stonework, soaring windows, classical proportions, yet no people walk the sidewalks, no horses pull carriages, no vendors hawk their wares. These urban landscapes appear frozen in time, as if an entire civilization had simply vanished moments before the camera clicked. These images fuel some of the most compelling questions in Tartaria research. If these cities were bustling centers of 19th century American life, why do so many photographs show them as eerily deserted? Were these pictures taken at unusual times of day? Were the streets cleared for some specific reason? Or do these photographs document something else entirely? Cities that had been abandoned, ruins that were later repopulated, or structures that were never as inhabited as official histories suggest. To understand what we're actually seeing in these photographs, we need to understand how early photography worked. The technology that created these mysterious images operated according to physical principles that shaped every picture in ways modern viewers often don't recognize. The earliest practical photographic process, Louis Daguerre's daguerreotype method developed in the 1830s, required exposure times that ranged from several minutes in bright sunlight to 20 or 30 minutes in dimmer conditions. During these long exposures, the camera captured only objects that remained perfectly still. Moving people, animals, and vehicles simply didn't register on the photographic plate. They moved too quickly to leave any visible trace. This creates a paradox that explains many empty city photographs. Busy streets full of pedestrians, carriages, and commercial activity would appear completely deserted if everything was in motion during the exposure period. Only stationary elements, buildings, street lamps, fire hydrants, and occasionally a person who stood still long enough would appear in the final image. The most famous example is Daguerre's own 1838 photograph of Boulevard du Temple in Paris. This busy thoroughfare appears almost empty in the image, showing only a single figure, a man getting his shoes shined who remained in one position long enough for the camera to capture him. Contemporary accounts describe the street as crowded with pedestrians, carriages, and street vendors, but none of this activity appears in the photograph because it was all in constant motion. American cities during the mid to late 1800s were experiencing unprecedented growth and activity. New York, Chicago, Boston, and San Francisco were centers of commerce, immigration, and industrial development. Streets would have been filled with people, horses, carriages, and the constant bustle of urban life. Yet photographs from this period often show these same streets as mysteriously empty. The photographic explanation accounts for much of this apparent emptiness, but not all of it. Some photographs were clearly taken at dawn or dusk when streets would naturally be less crowded. Photographers often preferred these times because the light was more favorable, and the reduced activity made it easier to capture sharp images of architectural details. Other photographs were taken immediately after disasters, fires, earthquakes, or severe weather, when normal urban activity had been disrupted. The aftermath of Chicago's Great Fire in 1871 generated many photographs of empty, damaged streets that later served as documentation for reconstruction planning. These images showed genuine depopulation, but for documented historical reasons rather than mysterious ones. However, some photographs resist easy explanation through conventional photographic limitations or specific circumstances. These images show completed buildings, well-maintained streets, and urban infrastructure that appears ready for use, yet displays no evidence of the human activity that such infrastructure was designed to support. Consider photographs of major construction projects from the late 1800s. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, required 14 years of construction involving hundreds of workers at any given time. Yet many photographs of the bridge construction show remarkably few people, even in images that were clearly taken during active work periods rather than at the beginning or end of construction days. Similarly, photographs of major buildings under construction, the Chicago World's Fair structures, various state capitals, prominent commercial buildings, often show elaborate scaffolding, partially completed facades, and evidence of active work, but relatively few workers visible in the images. This pattern appears even in photographs that were clearly taken during normal working hours rather than before dawn or after sunset. The conventional explanation involves the practical realities of construction photography. Photographers working with bulky equipment and long exposure times often had to coordinate with construction foremen to temporarily clear work areas for safety reasons. Workers might be directed to other parts of the site during photography sessions to prevent accidents and ensure clear views of the architectural details that were the primary subject of documentation. Moreover, construction photography served specific purposes that influenced how and when pictures were taken. These images were often commissioned by architects, investors, or city officials to document progress, showcase engineering achievements, or create promotional materials. Such photographs prioritized clear views of structural elements and architectural details over documentation of human activity. The timing of photography also reflected practical considerations. Construction sites were often photographed during lunch breaks, shift changes, or other periods when work activity was naturally reduced. Photographers preferred these moments because they provided better lighting conditions and clearer sight lines without compromising worker safety or interfering with construction. Schedules. Yet some researchers argue that the consistent absence of people in these images suggests something more systematic than photographic limitations or scheduling conveniences. They point to the vast scale of construction projects documented in these photographs and question whether the workforce required for such ambitious undertakings could have been completely invisible due to exposure times and timing. The Chicago World's Fair provides a particularly intriguing case study. Contemporary accounts describe 27 million visitors during the fair's 6-month run in 1893. The The construction phase allegedly employed thousands of workers over more than 2 years, yet photographs of both the construction and the operational periods often show remarkably empty spaces. Some construction photographs do show workers, but often fewer than might be expected for projects of such scale and complexity. Photographs of the fair during its operational period show the magnificent White City buildings, but relatively sparse crowds. Despite written accounts describing overwhelming attendance that sometimes required crowd control measures, this pattern extends to urban photography more generally. Photographs of completed 19th century American cities often show streets that appear designed for much larger populations than are visible in the images. The infrastructure, wide boulevards, elaborate public buildings, extensive commercial districts, suggest cities planned for populations that don't seem to match the photographic evidence of actual inhabitants. Alternative researchers interpret this as evidence that these cities might have been built by or for a different population than the one documented in official census records and immigration statistics. They suggest that the infrastructure reflects the needs and scale of a previous civilization, possibly Tartarian, that was later adapted for use by smaller populations. However, photographic evidence from the same period shows abundant human activity when examined more comprehensively. While individual photographs might show empty streets due to technical or circumstantial factors, collections of photographs from the same locations and time periods reveal the bustling urban life that official records document. The New York Public Library's digital collections, for example, include thousands of photographs from late 19th century Manhattan that show crowded streets, busy markets, and dense pedestrian traffic. The apparent emptiness of some images reflects the selectivity of what gets preserved and digitized rather than the actual patterns of urban life. Photography during this period was expensive and technically demanding. Most photographs were taken by professional photographers working on commission for specific purposes: architectural documentation, real estate promotion, city planning, or commercial advertising. These purposes naturally influenced what was photographed and how the resulting images were composed. Street scenes crowded with people and activity were difficult to photograph successfully with early equipment and didn't serve the documentary purposes that most commissioned photography was intended to fulfill. As a result, the photographic record from this period contains a disproportionate number of images showing empty or sparsely populated urban spaces. This selection bias creates a misleading impression when modern researchers examine historical photographic collections. The images that survived and were preserved represent specific types of photography rather than comprehensive documentation of urban life. Moreover, the photographs that fuel Tartaria theories are often those that have been digitized and made available online, representing another layer of selection bias. Images that are considered historically significant, architecturally interesting, or visually striking are more likely to be preserved, digitized, and shared than routine documentation of daily life. The result is a digital historical record that overrepresents mysterious, empty urban spaces and underrepresents the ordinary bustle of 19th century city life. This creates the impression that American cities of this period were somehow depopulated or underutilized relative to their infrastructure. Reading historical photographs requires understanding not just how the technology worked, but also why particular images were created and how they were selected for preservation. The apparent mysteries disappear when we consider the full context of photographic practice, preservation patterns, and digitization priorities. Yet the sense of mystery persists because these photographs tap into something deeper than technical explanations can fully address. The empty streets and monumental buildings captured in these images evoke feelings of displacement, loss, and hidden history that resonate with contemporary anxieties about urbanization, technological change, and cultural continuity. Perhaps the real mystery isn't why these photographs appear to show empty cities, but why we find empty cities so compelling and unsettling. Perhaps our fascination with these images reflects our own complicated relationship with urban environments that sometimes feel too large, too impersonal, or too disconnected from human-scale community life. The photographs exist, and they document real places at real moments in time. But what they document may be less about vanished civilizations and more about the complex relationship between human activity and the built environments we create to house our collective aspirations. In the end, the most mysterious thing about these photographs might be what they reveal about our own desires to find hidden meaning in the spaces we inhabit and the histories we inherit. Part 11. The Cosmic Connection. Some mysteries refuse to stay grounded. As we've journeyed through maps and architecture, through 5 and 5 and no, buried cities and phantom timelines, the Tartaria enigma has grown larger than any single civilization, any single continent, any single planet. In the deepest currents of alternative research, Tartaria becomes something cosmic, a bridge between our world and possibilities that stretch beyond the boundaries of conventional human history. This is where the speculation becomes most speculative, where we venture into territories that demand we label our journey clearly. We are no longer examining documented evidence, but exploring the mythological dimensions that surround the Tartaria mystery. We are asking not just what might have been, but what our hunger for hidden history reveals about who we are and what we hope to discover about our place in the universe. The cosmic connection begins with a simple observation. If Tartarian civilization achieved the architectural grandeur, technological sophistication, and global coordination suggested by alternative researchers, it would represent a level of human achievement that exceeds what we typically associate with any known historical civilization. Such capabilities, some argue, might require explanation beyond purely terrestrial human development. This leads to speculation about connections between Tartaria and other legendary advanced civilizations. Atlantis, Lemuria, or the various lost continents and golden ages that appear in mythological traditions around the world. According to this view, Tartaria wasn't an isolated phenomenon, but part of a larger pattern of advanced civilizations that have risen and fallen throughout human history, leaving behind only fragments that conventional archaeology and history have failed to properly interpret. The Atlantis connection draws particularly strong interest because both mythologies involve advanced civilizations that supposedly possess technologies beyond what their contemporary societies should have been capable of achieving. Plato's account in the Timaeus and Critias describes Atlantis as a maritime empire with sophisticated engineering, advanced metallurgy, and architectural capabilities that allowed them to construct elaborate temples and harbours. However, scholarly consensus regards Plato's Atlantis as philosophical allegory rather than historical documentation. The dialogue uses the Atlantis story to explore questions about ideal governance, military virtue, and the relationship between human ambition and natural limitations. The details of Atlantean civilization serve the philosophical argument rather than documenting actual historical events or locations. Lemuria represents a different kind of speculative connection. Originally proposed in the 19th century by zoologist Philip Sclater to explain biogeographical puzzles, why similar species appeared on continents separated by vast oceans, Lemuria was conceived as a lost landmass that had once connected Africa, India, and Australia. The hypothesis was rendered obsolete by the development of plate tectonic theory, which explained species distribution through continental drift rather than vanished continents. However, Lemuria persisted in occult and metaphysical traditions as the setting for spiritually advanced civilizations that supposedly preceded recorded history. These traditions, developed by figures like Helena Blavatsky and later elaborated by various New Age movements, describe Lemurian civilization as possessing psychic abilities, crystal-based technologies, and spiritual understanding that surpassed material scientific achievement. The most speculative cosmic connections link Tartaria to extraterrestrial contact or intervention. According to these theories, the architectural and engineering achievements attributed to Tartarian civilization exceeded what human societies could have developed independently, suggesting either direct contact with advanced non-human intelligence or the inheritance of knowledge from previous civilizations that had received such contact. This interpretation draws on broader ancient astronaut theories that interpret various historical and archaeological anomalies as evidence of extraterrestrial influence on human development. Proponents point to the global distribution of similar architectural forms, pyramids, and megalithic structures, precision stonework, as suggesting coordination or knowledge transfer that would have been impossible without advanced transportation and communication technologies. However, scientific evaluation of extraterrestrial contact claims faces the fundamental challenge that no verified physical evidence of non-human technology has been identified on Earth. The search for extraterrestrial intelligence, conducted by scientists around the world for more than 60 years, has not detected any confirmed signals or artifacts indicating the presence of advanced non-human civilizations. The architectural similarities that fuel ancient astronaut theories can be explained through convergent development, the tendency for human societies facing similar challenges to develop similar solutions independently. Pyramid forms appear in multiple civilizations because they represent stable, impressive structures that can be built with relatively simple tools and techniques. Precision stonework reflects the development of sophisticated craftsmanship within individual societies rather than external technological influence. Moreover, the assumption that human societies couldn't have achieved remarkable engineering and architectural results independently underestimates the capabilities of traditional knowledge systems. Indigenous peoples around the world developed sophisticated understanding of astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, and construction techniques through careful observation and experimentation over many generations. The cosmic dimensions of Tartaria research ultimately reflect something deeper than historical questions about specific civilizations. They represent humanity's ongoing fascination with the possibility that we are more than we appear to be, that our history contains chapters we haven't yet learned to read, and that our future might reconnect us with capabilities we've forgotten we once possessed. This fascination appears throughout human cultures in myths about golden ages, lost wisdom, and the gradual decline from more perfect original states. These mythological patterns suggest that the hunger for hidden, advanced civilizations addresses psychological and spiritual needs that transcend factual questions about historical events. Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious provides one framework for understanding why these mythologies resonate so strongly across cultures and generations. Jung proposed that certain symbolic patterns, archetypes, appear repeatedly in human consciousness because they reflect universal aspects of psychological development and spiritual aspiration. The myth of the lost advanced civilization serves several archetypal functions. It suggests that human potential exceeds current limitations. It provides hope that current problems might have been solved in the past and could be solved again, and it offers meaning that transcends the apparent randomness of historical development. Whether Tartaria, Atlantis, Lemuria, or other lost civilizations existed as historical realities may be less important than understanding what these mythologies reveal about human consciousness and cultural aspiration. They represent our collective attempt to imagine what human civilization might become capable of achieving under different conditions or with different priorities. The spiritual and metaphysical dimensions of Tartaria research also reflect contemporary concerns about technology, environment, and social organization. The vision of a civilization that achieved harmony between human activity and natural systems, that developed clean energy technologies, and that created architectural environments designed to enhance rather than diminish human well-being, speaks to current anxieties about industrial civilization's sustainability. In this context, Tartaria becomes less about recovering specific historical facts and more about imagining alternative possibilities for human development. The question shifts from, did this civilization really exist, to, what would it mean if such a civilization were possible? This imaginative dimension doesn't invalidate serious historical and archaeological research, but it does suggest that the appeal of alternative historical theories extends beyond factual questions to encompass deeper concerns about human identity, potential, and purpose. Perhaps the most cosmic aspect of the Tartaria mystery is its reminder that human consciousness contains capacities for wonder, speculation, and mythological thinking that persist despite, or perhaps because of, our increasingly materialistic and reductionist cultural environment. The hunger for hidden history, lost civilizations, and cosmic connections may represent an essential aspect of human consciousness. The intuition that reality contains more possibilities than conventional frameworks acknowledge, and that our understanding of who we are and what we might become remains fundamentally incomplete. Part 12. The Mystery of Memory. So here we are, At the end of our journey through maps that shouldn't exist, and photographs that haunt our imagination, through architecture that defies easy explanation, and timelines that don't quite add up, we began with a simple question. What if everything we know about Tartaria is wrong? Perhaps the answer is more complex than we expected. Perhaps the question itself reveals something important about how memory works, how history is constructed, and how human consciousness relates to the traces of the past that surround us in the present moment. Let's return to what we can actually verify. The maps are real. You can examine them yourself in libraries and digital archives around the world. European cartographers, working with the best information available to them, consistently labelled vast territories across Eurasia as Tartary from roughly the 13th century through the 19th century. The people are real. Tatar communities exist today across Russia, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe, maintaining distinct languages, cultural traditions, and ethnic identities that connect them to the historical peoples who inhabited the territories once labelled as Tartary on European maps. The architecture is real. The monumental buildings, the star-shaped forts, the elaborate stonework and impossible proportions that fuel alternative theories actually exist. You can visit them, measure them, and examine the craftsmanship that went into their construction. What remains disputed is not the physical evidence, but its interpretation. What do these maps, buildings, and cultural traces actually tell us about the past? How do we distinguish between documented history and speculative reconstruction? And how do we account for the gaps, inconsistencies, and mysteries that persist even within well-researched historical narratives? The mainstream academic interpretation provides coherent explanations for most of the phenomena we've explored. Tartary was indeed a geographical umbrella term that faded as European knowledge of Asian political structures became more precise. The architectural monuments reflect documented historical construction projects using well-understood techniques and materials. The apparent anomalies result from misunderstanding photographic limitations, urban development patterns, and the normal processes by which cities adapt their infrastructure over time. This interpretation is supported by extensive documentation, multiple independent lines of evidence, and consistency with broader patterns of historical development. It represents the best current understanding of professional historians, archaeologists, and other specialists who have dedicated their careers to studying these questions. Yet the alternative interpretations persist, and not merely among people who are ignorant of mainstream scholarship or predisposed to conspiracy theories. Some researchers who are familiar with conventional explanations continue to argue that something significant has been overlooked, simplified, or deliberately obscured in our understanding of recent history. They point to the speed and scale of urban construction in 19th century America, the sophistication of engineering solutions that seem to exceed documented technological capabilities, and the systematic nature of construction projects that required coordination and resources that challenge official accounts of how these civilizations developed. Perhaps most intriguingly, they note patterns of historical forgetting that seem to go beyond normal processes of cultural change and political transition. The completeness with which Tartary vanished from European consciousness, the systematic nature of urban reconstruction projects following disasters, and the consistent architectural styles that appeared simultaneously across vast distances all suggest coordination and intentionality that conventional explanations struggle to fully account for. This brings us to the heart of the mystery, not whether Tartarian civilization existed as a unified political entity, but how historical memory is constructed, maintained, and sometimes lost. Consider how much of the past has genuinely vanished from human memory. We know that writing systems have been lost, that entire languages have disappeared without leaving sufficient records for translation, that sophisticated technologies have been forgotten and had to be rediscovered by later civilizations. The Roman Empire's concrete technology produced structures that have lasted 2,000 years, but the specific techniques were lost during the medieval period and weren't fully understood. Again, until modern chemistry provided the theoretical framework to analyze ancient recipes, Damascus steel techniques produced legendary quality blades that modern metallurgy has struggled to replicate. Traditional indigenous knowledge systems around the world contain practical understanding of astronomy, navigation, medicine, and ecology that formal scientific education is still working to document and appreciate. If such knowledge can be lost and recovered repeatedly throughout history, what other capabilities, cultural achievements, or technological solutions might have been developed, lost, and forgotten so completely that we've lost even the memory that they once existed? This question becomes more pressing when we consider the fragility of historical records. Archives burn, libraries are destroyed, and political transitions often involve systematic efforts to eliminate evidence of previous systems that might challenge new authorities' legitimacy. The Library of Alexandria, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the Maya codices burned by Spanish missionaries, the Chinese historical records destroyed during various dynastic transitions, these represent only the most famous examples of how historical knowledge disappears through accident, neglect, or deliberate destruction. More subtly, historical knowledge disappears through processes of simplification and standardization that are designed to make complex realities more teachable and manageable. Textbook narratives necessarily reduce the complexity of historical development to key events, major trends, and representative examples that can be understood within limited educational timeframes. This simplification process often eliminates anomalies, exceptions, and alternative interpretations that don't fit neat chronological frameworks or clear causal explanations. The result is historical education that provides useful general understanding, but may systematically underrepresent the actual complexity, diversity, and strangeness of human development. The Tartaria mystery may represent one example of this broader pattern, a complex historical reality that was simplified, categorized, and eventually forgotten because it didn't fit the organizational frameworks that later historians and educators found most useful for their purposes. Whether or not Tartary ever existed as a unified political entity, the territories labeled with that name clearly supported sophisticated civilizations that left architectural, cultural, and technological traces that continue to puzzle researchers today. Some of these traces may have been incorrectly attributed to later periods or different civilizations, as historians worked to create coherent narratives that connected scattered evidence into comprehensible stories. The questions raised by Tartaria research about the speed of urban development, the sophistication of historical engineering, the coordination required for global architectural styles, and the completeness of certain types of historical forgetting deserve serious consideration, even if we ultimately conclude that they don't require radical revision of mainstream historical understanding. These questions remind us that history is always incomplete, that our knowledge of the past is constructed from surviving fragments rather than comprehensive records, and that the frameworks we use to interpret evidence inevitably shape what we're able to see and understand. The real mystery may not be whether a Tartarian empire once ruled half the world, but whether our current methods of historical investigation are sophisticated enough to recognize and interpret the full complexity of human civilizational development. Perhaps the traces that fuel Tartaria theories represent not a single lost civilization, but multiple civilizations, cultural exchanges, technological traditions, and political arrangements that were more complex, more internationally connected, and more technically sophisticated than our simplified historical narratives have recognized. Perhaps the mystery of memory extends beyond what we've forgotten to include, what we've never learned to remember properly. And perhaps the most important lesson of our journey through this enigma is not any specific conclusion about Tartarian civilization, but rather a renewed appreciation for the strangeness, complexity, and ultimate mystery of human consciousness encountering its own past. The maps exist, the buildings exist, the questions exist, and somewhere between the certainty of physical evidence and the uncertainty of interpretation, between the clarity of what we can measure and the mystery of what we can imagine, lies the ongoing conversation between human memory and human possibility. What if everything we know about Tartaria is wrong? Perhaps that's exactly the right question to keep asking, not because it leads to any particular answer, but because it keeps us wondering, questioning, and searching for deeper understanding of who we are and what our civilizations have been capable of achieving. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. The mystery continues.